Paul, how are you doing today in Denver?
I'm doing fantastic. I think I'm the opposite of you. Sunshine, no snow, and no coat.
Yeah, so two out of three we have over here. We have the no coat, and we do have snow here in Eastern Ontario, but it is sunny at least today. But yeah, one last kick at winter coming back after a little bit of a teaser of spring. So, folks, we have Susie Miller joining us here today. Susie, before you tell us about yourself, chime in. How's your weather over there across the
Yeah,
pond?
well, amazingly, we're having absolutely beautiful weather in the UK at the moment. So probably for about the last 2 weeks, we've had, absolute beautiful sunshine. So everyone's hoping this isn't going to be our summer, that we
Mm,
will actually, when this goes away, that actually we will have some summer. Sometimes it comes early and then just stays away for the whole of the rest of the year. So, but yeah, it's absolutely gorgeous at the moment.
yeah, and here in Canada, we always have a paranoia that if something's nice, it's just too nice, and we're going to pay for it
Yeah,
later. So even if
yeah,
if summer is nice, then the winter's really going to be rotten. Like you have this constant sort of doubt about the I
definitely,
don't know. We
definitely.
don't deserve the good weather yet, or something like
Very
that.
similar,
So
very similar in the
yeah, yeah,
UK.
yeah. Okay, so we've gotten past the weather. Susie, you've been with us on previous idiotic episodes, but there are probably folks joining us today who haven't met you before. So tell us a bit about yourself.
Okay, so as you very rightly introduced me, my name is Susie Miller. I'm an e-learning accessibility, probably I'd call myself an expert at this point. I've written a book called Designing Accessible Learning Content. I'm also, my background is learning and development, so I have an instructional design background. I've probably been doing that for, well, my whole career really, so many years. And I also now run my own kind of digital accessibility agency, which is called Ella Hub, and that really specializes in e-learning accessibility and helping organizations to make their learning content as accessible and inclusive as possible. And I was very, very honored recently to have won the Learning Professional Institute Learning Professional of the Year, the LPI Learning Professional of the Year award. So that was a great for me milestone for accessibility.
Hmm. Congrats on that for sure.
Thank you.
That's pretty cool. Yeah. Um, One of the things that I always find fascinating is how people end up, you know, getting involved in accessibility. Um, Folks have usually there's something,
Hmm.
beyond just being aware of it, knowing, that it's important, etc. Let's maybe start just briefly there. Like, what brought you into the world of accessibility? What's made it such a focus for you?
So I think it's what I tend to call in the work that I've been doing since I started Ella Hub, and the more people I speak to about accessibility, I completely agree with you. There usually is a couple of things or a thing that really gets people involved with accessibility. It's what I tend to call now the accessibility spark, and I think for me. My accessibility spark, I kind of talk about this in the book that I wrote in Designing Accessible Learning Content, was my experience when I was a teacher very early on in my career, a classroom teacher, and I had a student who was blind in my classroom, and I had absolutely no idea of how I could make what I was trying to teach her inclusive. So I think that was a real pivotal moment for me in my career, and actually finding out how I could include her in my teaching was really kind of instrumental in making me realize that the result of that was such a transformation on my practice and on the way that I taught. I was so lucky that that happened to me early in my career, but it wasn't really until I started becoming an instructional designer and got more into the digital side of things that again, I had a kind of another experience where I created some learning content and got some feedback, just general feedback from the organization I worked. And I was really lucky to have someone who was a screen reader user who said to me, I cannot access your learning content. And I had, at the time, again, I had absolutely no idea what a screen reader was, or that people would be accessing it never even occurred to me that people would be accessing my digital content with different access needs. And I was so privileged to be able to talk to her and see her use the assistive technology. And I think that was, for me, as an instructional designer, I just thought, I cannot continue to call myself an instructional designer and to be passionate about what I do unless I find out how other people are accessing my learning content and the type of technology they might be using, because I don't want to intentionally exclude anyone. So it was a very steep learning curve. I had so much to learn, but it was that kind of conviction that to do my job properly, something that I was very passionate about, I couldn't exclude anybody. I really needed to find out more about it and find out how to make it accessible for everyone.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's something, when you just said accessible for everyone, and I think a lot of us go through life in general, um, not experiencing everything, of course, outside our own experience until something like that happens. And, I've heard in the past before, and I'll be the first to admit that I've thought that is that, oh, well, I'm creating content for folks that they couldn't do this job if they had a disability. And as you learn, there's all sorts of different types of varying levels of ability, and of course, all sorts of different types of technology and assisted devices to help people in their lives with those different abilities there that for sure, of course, contrary to perhaps a belief that, yeah, there's people that can do that position, that job, the thing that you're aiming at, but still have the need for creating training that is fully inclusive. Of course, we often think of screen readers, but as you learn more, it's more than just that. Even though that is one of the target areas, and perhaps one of the areas that's a little more challenging at first to go ahead and address.
So I think coming back to what you were saying about that kind of, I suppose it's the misconceptions and the assumptions that people make. And I think, again, in my career, especially with the clients that I've worked with Ella Hub, and also the organizations that I've worked with myself, for a long time I haven't, I called it misconceptions and assumptions about people, but really at the heart of it, it's that sometimes when we talk about it, is important really to address the fact that we can call it ableism. It is sometimes the assumptions that we make just basically are kind of thinking, well, but it is really important that everybody has equal access. The assumptions that we make can so often be based on our own biases and our own experiences. So really, some of the the key things for me that I've seen, it's been such, as I say, I use it a lot, the word, but it has been such a privilege to see people that do have access needs and to see just how much that they can achieve. And then it comes back, as Paul, you were saying, to that idea of nobody with a disability would be able to do that job, or we don't need to worry about people with that kind of disability, because and then it's for me, the experience that I've had myself of being diagnosed as dyslexic. So the whole kind of transformation of understanding finally, why my brain works in the way it does, and and how much that actually has held me back, for many years in education and in the workplace. For me, I suppose that's a very personal experience, which really brings home why it's so important to have this accessibility as the default mindset, because there is no way that we can know what type of access needs people will have. And that's not even talking about people that have temporary or situational access needs as well. So I think it's that, for me, I think the more work I've done, the more kind of committed I am to challenging assumptions, and if that be ableism, where people kind of think, well, actually someone with a disability or an access need is less than, then that's something that I feel much more confident to do now. You know, at the beginning I was kind of, you know, maybe shying away from that, but I think it's so important to actually challenge that, you know, the only way that we can start challenging it is by really recognizing that exists, and we all have our own, you know, unconscious biases as well, that, you know, that really, you know, I have to challenge on a daily basis still, however long you're working in the you know, in the field.
Yeah, this is an area where your learning is never completed either. There's always,
Completely agree.
you know, you start out with some of the more obvious things, such as being able to accommodate screen readers successfully, or, you know, I don't know, the big, the headline, you know, kind of things that we need to think about. But you're always finding that there are more things that you can do things that you can do, you know, differently. It's not like the journey is never finished, really, on this front.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's where the the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which are the kind of the international standard for accessibility, sometimes, you know, they are sometimes quite difficult to understand and interpret. And when you talk about, you know, never being done, obviously you've got technology which is changing all of the time as well, so things do rapidly change. But I think from the point of view of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, the fact that having spent I don't know how many years, you know, researching them and writing a book, or writing a second edition of a book recently, is that however much time I spend, there are still things about them that you know, I look back on something, or I'll suddenly discover and something that's exempt, or, you know, I realize I've kind of misinterpreted something. So from the point of view of the standards, I think they kind of lend themselves to kind of constantly discovering new things, I could say, about them. But as I say, the technology is changing as well, I think, is a real important factor in kind of that idea of just sometimes it can feel difficult to keep on top of every kind of aspect of accessibility. But I think for all of their faults, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines are a great place to start. You know, they do cover you know, a lot of technology. They cover a lot of different access needs as well. So for me, that's a really key thing, I think, for people who are wanting to get on board with accessibility. I kind of think often I maybe when I work with clients, I see the sort of what I call the top tips you know, effect. So there is a lot of information out there on accessibility now, which is brilliant. I mean, some of it's great, some of it's maybe not so good, but I think that the idea with the top tips kind of concept is that sometimes it gives the impression that this is all you need to do. You know, these sort of 10 tips are done it, and then, you know, you're legally compliant. Whereas if you kind of know a bit more about accessibility, you know, actually, you know, the WCAG standards, if you're meeting the general legal standard, that's the WCAG A and AA standards. That's 55 standards that you need to be aware of, and for the version 2, the complete set is 86 standards. So, you know, there is a huge range in there that you need to be able to understand. And the top tips are great. I'm not kind of criticizing that at all. It's just sometimes I think we come away thinking, well, that's it, I've done it now because I've followed those tips that I found. So it's just a little bit more complicated than that, which is part of the reason that I wanted to put this benchmark together, was to kind of make sure that people kind of understood, if they were trying to make something accessible, it was a little bit more especially if it's legally compliant, it is more detailed than just looking at some kind of top tips.
Mm-hmm. I once heard a definition of expertise as: an expert is someone who knows that they don't know yet.
Yeah.
So in that regard, I think once you start down this path of accessibility and recognize there is so much, I think maybe from that perspective, you achieve expert status, mostly by humility, maybe. But
yeah, definitely. It's
from
that
that
progress
regard.
over perfection, making mistakes.
Yeah.
Well,
Paul, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I was thinking, yeah, as you said, it is a journey, and I almost think of those top 10 tips as that's to get you started on the journey.
Yeah.
As you move down. And speaking to the standards, there was a recent one that I worked with a client there, and standards about radio buttons and some other things. And
Okay.
until you start to read in e-learning, a lot of radio buttons or things are used for basically multiple choice type questions or other things there.
Yeah.
But there's a specific standard there that as you read in and then read the examples and get to the more details, you
Yeah.
realize that particular standard is really to handle primarily things like putting in your credit card and all the other information and
Yeah.
having that informative around what you're doing, where if you just read the first part, you would think, oh, that applies to this other section, which it completely does not.
Yeah. I agree. Yeah.
And then, of course, you get into the case you mentioned, the technology's always changing. And hey, how come when I use JAWS, I get a different experience when I use NVDA? Or for the matter of, if you're new to this, just like if you were, I don't know if anybody can remember when, but they were new to Word, you didn't understand all the things on it, and you're not an expert in using that tool. I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about some tips for people getting started in that journey. I mean, it sounds like your benchmark might be a good idea too, because it's hard to go ahead and measure if I've made improvement unless I actually measure to see where I'm at.
Yeah, I think that's the key thing for me is that there's so much there are so many, as I say, misconceptions, not only around accessibility and disability, but also around the kind of the operational side of making content accessible. And I think that's again why I think that I had this idea of wanting to have a benchmark, because it is that there isn't, and I've so often in talks have said there is no data. I'm not aware of any data that is telling us how accessible the industry is at the moment. So the idea with the benchmark is allowing us as an industry to see where we're at, and then also trying to empower people as well to feel more confident about making their own learning content accessible. So the idea of the industry is, once we benchmark, once we know where we're at, that's when we can start making steps on getting better. At the moment, we just don't really know. We think we're not in a great place. It's really interesting, the data that we've got back from the benchmarking so far is actually more positive than I would have expected it to be. Now, that may be because a lot of the people who are engaging with it are people who are already on board with accessibility, because obviously they're finding out about it through me. But if that's not the case, if we get more data in and we see that actually, this could be something really positive, that we can say actually in these areas, as an industry, we are doing really well. But I think the starting with, so the benchmark deliberately does, it's quite detailed. It has 60 questions, and they are all based on the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines or strategic implementation in your organization, so that we get a really good broad picture of what's happening. But I think, as you say, Paul, unless if you don't know where you're starting with, you can't see the improvement that you're making, really. And I think that's such an important thing, because when we talk about accessibility, it can sometimes be quite overwhelming, and you think, oh, I mean, at the beginning, for me, I so often felt like I'm just going to have to give up, because this is just too complicated. So it's trying to give people a sense of, okay, I may not know exactly where we're at, but actually, if I answer these questions, I can see, oh, this is the area these are the areas where I'm doing really well, and these are the areas where we still need to be putting some work into it, rather than just this kind of vast, oh, it's just unmanageable, and I just I'm not really sure what's going on or where to start, really.
60 questions does sound somewhat daunting. And so just to help people,
10 minutes. Only takes
perfect. So that was one
minutes.
first thing was so how long, just to give people a sense, if they're going to click the link that we shared in the the session info.
Genuinely, our data shows it does take people about 10 to 15.
Okay, right on. So it's not a super big time commitment.
No.
And I mean, do folks have to do any pre-thinking or anything, or just basically go through the info?
I mean, all of the questions are based on the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and what it does is so just to give you an example, the question on the color contrast. So if we go back to our top tips, kind of a theme, the top tip might say to you, oh, you've got to have good color contrast. Well, what does that actually mean? So the question would be, okay, for this WCAG standard, you need to make sure that you're meeting 4.5 to 1 contrast ratio. You need to know about the font size that you're using and whether it's bold or up. That's how in depth meeting color contrast requirements to meet those standards are. And I'm not saying that everybody has to meet those standards, but if you want to have a benchmark of what you're doing, that's why it's so important. So the questions will all outline kind of what the web content accessibility guidelines are asking, and ask you if you're applying that to your learning. So sometimes you might need a maybe a little bit longer just to digest the question and really understand what it's asking you, but they're all they are all based on what we should be doing if we're meeting those standards and making our content accessible for everybody and to legal requirements as well.
Very cool. Yeah.
And with that standard, I think the what's in it for me. So I'm thinking if they go through that questionnaire, one, it's going to help them target and reveal and understand. But thinking of that journey as they're improving it, how can they use that questionnaire kind of ongoing to help their own processes and their own training content?
Okay, so so we've kind of built in so that the fact that they have to, we're asking them to spend this time doing it means that they will get a report at the end of it, and the report comes with, the category feedback, the overall score that they've got, a score for each of the categories of the ELA framework. That's how I've broken down those great long list of web content accessibility guidelines, and then it also comes with recommendations of if you're not, it's got some resources and some recommendations for how that they can improve. So it's a good starting point for really, as I say, benchmarking where you are and looking at some of the things that you can improve as well.
It's almost a path, if you will, or a roadmap for things that they could go ahead and continue as they continue their journey to make their content more accessible.
Definitely, and they can access it, as many times as they want to. So the idea is it will be open for quite a while, so that people can go back maybe after 3 months, maybe after 6 months, and see where they're at. So that's a great, hopefully, incentive to kind of improve, and hopefully they'll be seeing some real benefits from doing that as well.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting. You commented earlier about folks thinking they were maybe worse off than they were. Anecdotally, I've kind of seen the same, and maybe it's the nature of who goes into instructional design, that they want a high level of quality out of their stuff. But I've heard from some of our customers that as the organization as a whole said accessibility is important for everything in the organization, sometimes they found that their learning group was far ahead of the rest of the organization. Not everyone necessarily, but of a majority of the organization. And even though when they started out, they said they thought they were far behind, they were actually the opposite. Not that there wasn't still things to do, but
so I've seen as well, actually, quite often in the organizations that I've worked with, I tend to focus, although we do broader organizations, but we tend to focus on the learning content and learning teams, and very often it's the learning teams that are the catalyst for then spreading the accessibility spark across the rest of the organization, because they can actually, and I think that is, I completely agree with you, Paul, that the fact that as an industry, we are very passionate about what we do. We genuinely want to do, we want to create learning content that really has an impact and is really effective. And accessibility is such an important part of that. And I think I've seen some absolutely wonderful examples of people being able to articulate how important and how effective and transformational accessibility has been on their learning content, and then to kind of convey that to the rest of the organization. So then, for example, we've kind of maybe had follow-on workshops with maybe the marketing team, for example, or the branding team, etc. So it's that because I think, as you say, that A, they're passionate about it, and B, they really see the impact that accessibility makes on the quality of their practice, of what they're doing. And I think that was, for me, one of the things that I really was so driven to kind of get an award, because award aside, because I wanted to show that actually the key kind of like that, this hidden risk of not making your learning content accessible is that you are just missing out on the most fantastic and amazing and wonderful opportunity to really improve the practice. If you're a practitioner, if you're an organization, to kind of make your content more effective. So many of the audits that we do at Ella Hub, we see the content before it's been, we've done an audit, and the after, and it's just transformational because it has such an impact on the way, as an instructional designer myself, I've had this experience myself, but you cannot design anything the way that you used to. Paul, you were saying earlier about having just your own perspective. You can't, once you find out about accessibility, you can't just design it in the way that you always have done. You have to be thinking, it really puts your learner at the center of the learning. It makes it learner centric. They're really at the heart of everything that you do. And every time you're designing something, you're thinking, well, how about someone with that access need, and how can I? And what it does is it just makes you such a better instructional designer, because you're thinking about things, you're using innovation, it's just absolutely transformational. And I think the real key transformation for me is seeing the experience of all learners. So we focus a lot, obviously, on people with disabilities and access needs. Also important to focus on people with situational and temporary access needs, but it isn't just those people, it's everybody. It just pulls out the kind of good instructional design. Is your language plain and straightforward? Are your instructions clear? Is your navigation consistent? Those types of things make it such a better learner experience for everybody, not just people with disabilities and access needs.
Mm-hmm. I was just prior to this, I had a call with one of our user groups, and the client was mentioning that because of the audience, the verbiage basically was at a very, his description was at a fairly low functional level. But what crossed my mind was, well, that just also means that it's going to work for everybody, right?
Definitely, absolutely, definitely.
It's focusing on that and realizing that that's not it might be a challenge, but it's not a problem. But it does improve things for everyone in that regard, that plain or simpler language
definitely
helps everybody, for example.
Yeah. And it was interesting for me, the experience I had of writing the book and then changing that book into an online self-access program. That was probably the hardest thing for me, because I had the language there already, but I was used to being, writing for a book, and then trying to simplify that was probably what took me the longest, and I think it was before we had AI that was so helpful in doing that. It just took me, it was so complex to try and make sure that I could explain these ideas in a straightforward and simple way. It was just so, it just took me such a long time. It is much improved now by having AI to give me some pointers.
At some point, somewhere along the way, someone introduced me to the FOG index, which rates, the complexity, let's say, of language. I'm probably describing that poorly, but what I did was, having learned about this, and this was about, I think this was maybe even public service writing or so. Anyway, but I thought, well, that's interesting, and so I picked up a copy of one of my all-time favorite novels, and I just took some hunks of it, and I went, oh, this author, Booker Prize winning author, has had movies made out of his stories, etc. He's writing at an 8th grade level.
Yeah.
But this is fantastic, amazing, immersive language that pulls you in. But ran it through the FOG index, and it was an 8th grade level. I went,
fantastic. Yeah. And that's one of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. The AAA requirements is that it should be, I think, a educational age of is it 9 to, I always forget. It's my dyslexia. I'm not very good with figures. Anyway, it's much lower than you think. It's 9th grade, I think.
That's why you have the guide to refer to it, and come out of this.
Yeah, I can't be leafing through it now, but yes, it'll come back to me probably later. But yes, anyway, it's much lower than you think. And I think for me as well, when you're talking about online content, it's that all of those skills that we have, the skim reading, the scan reading, is kind of facilitated by. So it is a different experience, I think, when you're reading content online. So obviously, that's so important for our learning content that's included. So yeah, no, great point.
You and this has come up before. You mentioned AI, and in the last couple conferences, of course, that's 90% of the talks are about AI.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I frequently have heard, "Hey, how can AI help me with my e-learning content?" And starting to see some of the accessibility tools start to bring some of that in that were already designed to help you with your accessibility. But tell us a little bit more about, since it sounds like you've had a little bit of experience with using AI and some of the ways that you're seeing it's helped you, or that you're anticipating perhaps you might see some help for you and others in the future.
So I think that, and this is obviously a very personal experience. So I think where it's really helped me a lot is with my dyslexia. So because it allows me to, it's very helpful at structuring my ideas. So my ideas come out in a kind of a jumble of, stuff. And in the past, it's taken me a long time to kind of really be able to sort of work out how things link. I find that really, really helpful. So if I'm planning content, whether that's on a day-to-day, being a business owner, all the type of things that you have to do for your social media, etc., those type of things, or if I'm writing an article, it's really, really helped me to structure that. So in a way, I'm quite pleased that we didn't have AI when I was writing the book. I mean, that was blood, sweat, and tears that went into, especially the first, well, both editions really, but it was all, I got there in the end. But I think if I'd had AI, it would have been a lot easier. I think just for me, it's seeing different options and, asking, for 3 or 4 different ways of structuring it or something really helps me to kind of then clarify what I'm trying to say, rather than getting it obviously to do things, just to say, write a book on accessibility. It's really helpful just to have kind of a different viewpoint and to get that as a kind of a point, or a good starting point. But the really key one that I use a lot actually is alternative text. So the functionality now of being able to give you, and obviously we always say with AI, it's a great starting point. So it for me, especially for things like LinkedIn, for example, posts that I wouldn't in the past have been able to post with imagery in them, just because it would have taken me so long to do the alternative text. I now will use a lot more imagery because I have a good starting point with AI, and that saves me a huge amount of time. In the Design Accessible Learning Content program, I actually employed someone to do the alternative text for me, and if I was again starting from scratch now, I would do that myself, because I have that kind of basis. It's just a great, especially again coming back to my dyslexia, interpreting charts and graphs and things like that are something I find very, very difficult. So just having that starting point. Obviously, then that comes back to the sort of limitations. So we were talking about the kind of checking accessibility tools. So we have, tools for a long time that have been, able to automatically check content, but we know that they are about 30% accurate. And I think at the moment, AI, this idea that, we've got an AI tool that will check everything for you and make sure it's fully accessible. At the moment, I don't think that we're there. We still need human interaction. And coming back to the alternative text, that is something, an example I use sometimes with clients, because, how can you tell, unless it's the context of imagery in a piece of learning content, as the instructional designer, why you've chosen that image, what's the kind of the message, the learning that the reason that you've chosen that is something, that context isn't necessarily something that AI is sophisticated enough to do. So that's really just one example. But I mean, I think AI can just lead to the most brilliant innovation. So you see with a lot of the tools available in assistive technology, AI implement. A really good one for me is the Be My Eyes app, where is an app that you have where if you are blind or you've got low vision, then you can call on someone in the community who is sighted to assist you. For example, you could be, for example, in a shop and you want to see what color the two shirts are, for example. You can call someone up and they can they can assist you, which I think is an incredible, it's an incredible app anyway. But they've now got an AI version of it, which means that it's obviously a little bit more slick, as in there's always someone, it's not, you're not relying on humans. You are, and that doesn't always work. It obviously has its glitches, but it is, it can be really, really helpful. For example, reading labels on packages, for example, things like that. So you see, it's a huge, a really huge advantage for accessibility, but I think just not being over reliant on it. Another one that I always talk about as well is sign language interpretation. So the sophistication of the technology now, where you can actually have avatars that really do a good job of ASL, American Sign Language or British Sign Language, whereas in the past that it was never quite sophisticated enough to be able to do the facial expressions and the hand gestures, but it's really much more sophisticated now. So there's lots of great things with AI, but as always, it's just using it wisely, really.
Yeah, I had a couple of follow-up questions. So first off,
Okay.
I thought I heard you say BMI for the app.
Yeah,
And of course, when I hear BMI, body mass index, so I know it wasn't that. But then you also talked about using AI to write alt text, and
yeah.
I've dabbled in it. I'm sure some folks in our audience have too. But how do you go and operate? Do you upload the image and tell it to write alt text, or tell us a little bit more about both that app and how you might actually operationalize that?
Okay, so the app is called actually Be My Eyes. So it's 3 words. Be My Eyes. Sorry. So it's not about your BMI. And I mean, there is quite obviously so much. I tend to use ChatGPT for there's I can send you a link. There is a tool within ChatGPT that will do your alternative text, and you can. Why I really like it is you can upload any image to it, and it will give you either alternative text, so maybe the shortened, sort of sentence or two that you might put in the alt text field if you were, using any software. But you can also ask it to give you full descriptive text, which it really is quite sophisticated in the type of description it will come back and give you. And sometimes I will use a combination of both. But it's a great starting point, as I say, to kind of really save you so much time. It literally saves me hours and hours.
And I just posted, I just found the link. I wasn't aware. I figured that, of course, there would be something, but having not tried it out myself. And that's something too. We have posts in our community about how to write alt text, because some people think just there. But as soon as you start looking at a little more complex image, you realize this isn't as simple as I thought it was. Just like writing a good 5-sentence paragraph is not as simple as it always seems to be there. So
Definitely.
that's
and
fantastic.
that comes back to the context as well. So you can shape it by saying this. So for example, if you were doing it, if it wasn't a piece of learning, you had a diagram, you could say, I want you to bring in the description, I want you to be bringing out these learning points from this diagram. That type of thing can be really, really helpful, and it can, as I say, because obviously you can prompt it to kind of shape what you're trying to convey. So yeah, it can be really helpful.
I was thinking too to what Chris had said about the fog index and what AI too, that can probably tell it to use the fog index or any of the other guidelines to say, hey, review this concept and the content there. I want you to rewrite it in 2 ways, make sure all of it's using this.
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, I've experimented with the fog index, or with the kind of readability checkers, and it's not always is one of the things. You'll say I want it at grade level 5, and then you will check it, and it's not always. That's one of the things. And that to be fair, I did that a lot. I would probably say about a year ago. So now it might be more sophisticated than it was then, but it's always worth double checking. And things like the kind of complexities of using AI and not just relying on what it says. But yeah, no, and for me, what I find as well is that having three different, so I might say give this to me at grade level 4, grade level 5, grade level 6, and then there's usually kind of snippets that I take from maybe one the other, and then I feel comfortable, and it really, it's a simplified way of trying to explain what I'm trying to explain, but still using my voice, not using AI. That doesn't feel too AI. It just feels like something that you would say.
Mhm. One of the most of my social media time is spent in Mastodon these days, which is a very geeky place to be. But there's a very strong devotion in a sense to alt text on images, and people will refuse to boost something in a lot of cases if it doesn't
Okay.
have alt text, and they'll make these
Yeah.
the statements. So it's and I don't post a lot, but want to share a photo of something or whatever, but the number of ways that you could write and rewrite. So the words in my post and then an image, that's the quick part. It's the alt text. Spending. Oh wait, I'm now 112 words in. Character. Yeah, it's remarkable how when you look at something and you think about, well, why is this important? What do I want someone to get out of the experience of this image? It's a fascinating rabbit hole to go down at times.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah.
When you can't write a full paragraph, it's not
Well,
1,000 words.
Well, but that's what the picture is worth, right? So,
Yes.
ah, so
I
we've
had the
talked
same
about,
challenge with some other images recently on a blog post because there was so much going on. I'm like, okay, I need to get the whole gist of what that's accomplishing, and then use things like a caption or include more description in the text to refer to it. But
so we've shared the link to your benchmarking assessment tool, and really hope that folks pick up on that, check it out, start putting that into action as a way of
Wonderful. Yeah.
of taking their own journeys forward. Not to put you totally on the spot, but
Okay.
I mean, for your own journey forward,
Yeah.
do you have things in mind of what you want to, where are you going next in terms of learning more or doing more, etc. in this space?
Yeah, I think it is that coming back to that progress over perfection. So always thinking that you could do better. So I think one of the things that there's been a really valuable lesson for me is having changed the book into an online forum as well to kind of give the practical side of implementing accessibility and learning content. That is that comes with we have a forum on that, and the amount of amazing questions and issues that people are coming up with on that forum is something that completely keeps me on my toes all the time, because whenever you think, okay, I kind of think I'm okay, I'm quite confident now that I've probably had every possible, like you were talking, Paul, with your targets, every possible complexity I've come across, and then on the forum we get so many really interesting questions. Oh, what about if it's this situation, or we have a piece of learning where we have to do this? And it just makes me, all the time, I'm just so I'm not going to say, I'm going to say privileged again. I am really privileged to be able to have that learning from, as people are going through the program, and they have their light bulb moments, and then it leads to kind of further questions. So I think a key thing for me is realizing, so we now refresh that course every year, and that's not only because of all of the things that I'm learning, but also but because the technology is changing as well. So it does never stay still when it comes to accessibility. But again, I think as I say, sometimes it can feel a little bit overwhelming, but I think it is, at its heart, it is you're making things better all of the time, and that's the sense of purpose that you get. So one of the things that I talk about sometimes is what I call quiet accessibilizing, which comes from in the lockdown when we had quiet quitting, and it kind of inspired me to think, okay, quiet accessibilizing. And I think sometimes if you're in an organization, I think that there's still sometimes a big divide between necessarily people at grassroots level who really understand why it's so important, and then maybe at leadership level when it's much more of a strategic and it might get put on the back burner like it often does. It can be really frustrating, and it's certainly something that I've experienced myself. So I think the power of accessibility for practitioners is just the fact that even if people around you don't agree with you, you can still do something absolutely phenomenally positive that has an impact on your own practice, but also will impact people around, or anyone who's doing your learning content. And for me, having feedback from people, because that's the other thing we tend to do in our industry or in our sector, is we think, okay, we're talking about people who have disabilities, but we don't have anyone with a disability in our own sector. And then you think, well, actually, I have an access need. There's statistics that I talk about a lot, which is from the Boston Consulting Group, and they did some research, I think in 2023, and the reason it's so impactful, this research, is that they surveyed about 28,000 people across 16 countries. And they found out that although most organisations think between 4 to 7% of their workforce may have a disability or an access need, in this survey, they found that actually 25% of people identified as having a disability or an access need that that impacted a major life activity, which kind of echoes the disability legislation that we have. So 25% of your audience, potentially not being able to access your content, for me is something that kind of keeps me motivated, and to think actually this is having a phenomenal impact on people everywhere, anyone that's got access to my learning. And then the feedback that we get again from the forum is people with access needs are doing the learning, and they're saying, yes, this has been really, really helpful for me, because, or sometimes very, very happy to say, well, it's not always positive, sometimes we have to go back and rethink. So coming back to our alternative text, well, that really made us rethink everything that we've done upon our alternative text. So it's a constant kind of learning, just a learning process, really. And for me, that we always say we love learning, and I think most of us in this industry are lifelong learners. So that for me is the fantastic thing, is to be able to carry on improving something. You did the best you could at the time, and then you learn more and you can do better. And that's exactly the same with writing the second edition of the book. I was really, really really so happy when the WCAG standards changed, because it meant I could then write the second edition and I could go in and improve everything.
On it.
Everything that I wanted to on the first edition. And I'm sure I'm not sure if a third edition will actually come out when we have WCAG 3. Maybe I'll be retired by then, but...
Well, someone else will maybe pick up the torch.
Maybe, yes, that would be good, actually.
Yeah. Susie, you've used the word privilege a few times, and you even felt a little bit embarrassed, I think, by using it. But I will say, as always, it's been an absolute privilege to have you join us here today and talk about this very, very critical and important area here on instructional designers in offices drinking coffee. Hey, folks watching along, listening along in different places, don't forget, Instructional Designers in Offices Drinking Coffee is brought to you by Domino. Check us out if you're in the space. We do a lot of really good things in our tool for accessibility in particular too. So always happy to catch up with folks and talk more about those opportunities. So I'm going to take us over to the slide deck and play us with the music, and we can dance on out of here.